Today, I will present you the present edition of the European Energy Efficiency Scoreboard 2024, which we have developed and developed further under the ODYSSEE-MURE project. And as Didat said, I also wanted to introduce to you a second tool because the scoreboard as it is designed now does not position the countries with respect to the targets. Also, it could be further adapted. I will say a word about this. Today, the comparison is with the previous version, which I showed earlier in the project ODYSSEE-MURE in this webinar series. For those of you who have attended this presentation will hook up, but I will also explain the basics of the scoreboard for those who haven't been in touch with it previously. So this is the program for the next half an hour. I will recall how the scoreboard works and then analyze changes with respect to the 2023 scoreboard, because the scoreboard is still, I would say, under development, under investigation from a methodological perspective, and we learn also with the scoreboard, like with all tools. That's also very important to understand. I will have some specific discussion of building on also recent webinar on policies where we see increasing divergence between climate and energy efficiency policies, and will illustrate that with measures which we have been collected for the industrial sector for Germany. Then, as already said, give you a brief introduction to the energy efficiency policy assessment tool to allow comparing of measures, in particular with target scenarios, and some conclusions from here. Now, starting with the first part, a quick recall or recap on the European Energy Efficiency Scoreboard, how it is calculated. And for those of you who have been participating in some earlier webinar, this slide may be familiar. The scoreboard which we have developed in the ODYSSEE-MURE project relies on three components. I just remind you that the ODYSSEE database contains statistical information on different energy efficiency indicators in different sectors, notably transport, services, households, and industry, in particular for the different European countries. And the MURE database collects information on energy efficiency policies in the different countries, and also collects notably quantified impacts for the different measures which we make use here in this scoreboard. So based on these two, or derived from these two databases, ODYSSEE-MURE, we have defined three components for the scoreboard. One is the achieved level of energy efficiency for a given energy use. For example, in the residential sector, the energy demand per square meter. I will show quickly later on how this is composed here for a sector. So the level that has been achieved at a given point in time today. The second component is the energy efficiency progress or trend over a given time period, where the energy efficiency has been improving. And again, the ODYSSEE database is used here, and the time evolution of the indicators is used. And for the policy scoreboard, we use the impact of the policies and normalize it naturally to the size of the country, the final energy of the sector, and enter this as the third component into the scoreboard. all of the three components are weighted, are weighted equally and then combined into an overall scoreboard. Sometimes the question arises whether there are different weights. No, they are the same, because sometimes it happens that, for example, one part of the scoreboard seems to dominate. But this is rather if, for example, other performances, for example, in the other two components is more in the middle of the scoring range, then differences can be comparatively small, and then smaller changes may have an impact on the ranking. We will see that also. So the overall score is then provided from that. And here you see what I just said, how the level and the trends are composed. For example, here, this is the residential sector. We see here for the heating end use, the consumption of square meter, but it is scaled to European climate to consider the differences among European countries, and also corrected for types of heating. There is a methodological document where you can read more on this, and similar other uses, end uses in the residential sector are integrated into the calculation of the levels and the trends. For example, consumption per dwelling for cooking and water heating, for appliances, or also the impact of solar in providing hot water. That is households. For industry, we already rely on a composite indicator, which we call ODYSSEE. The ODYSSEE is derived from individual industrial branches or productions, and then and indices are calculated for each of these branches and productions, and then weighted with the share in the energy consumption and aggregated into a total indicator, which we call ODYSSEE Energy Efficiency Index. And for the level, we use the adjusted energy intensity at European industry structure. Again, we try to correct for different industry structures. Some countries have a lighter industry structure and other countries more heavy ones. And this is not expression of energy efficiency, but rather differences, as said, in industrial policies, in industrial structures of the past. And this is an example, or this is a look to transport, list of indicators. This is based on specific consumptions for cars, for trucks and light vehicles, for air, and also the modal split for passenger and goods transport. And this is all, again, integrated into the indicator set, or into the two components, levels and trends, which we are talking about here. Now, having given this introduction, let me move on to the major changes in terms of results with the last calculation of the 2024 scoreboard compared to the previous edition. And here at first, you see a comparison between this year and the last year's scoreboard. And in this presentation, I have only used three colors, but I will make it a little bit more complex in the following. You see on the left-hand side the 2024 version of the scoring. And I have marked here in yellow positions that have remained the same, notably, for example, the first one in the case of Luxembourg. Between the 2024 and the 2023 edition, which is on the right-hand side. In green, countries that have gained positions, and in red, countries that have some loss in positions. And overall, naturally, in the mixture, there are countries who are losing positions and countries who gain or remain stable in this. We have here the 27 member states. However, this picture is a bit too rough because sometimes countries don't change a lot. They change position by one or two. So I reworked this picture to show you, and this is why the next slide has more colors, where I showed countries that have only a deviation of two ranges from the previous version of the scoreboard in a lighter color. For example, countries that have improved by 2 steps compared to last year, they are in the next slide in light green, and countries which have lost by maximum 2 steps, they are in light red or in orange in the next screen here. And this is what I just said. So when you look for the moment in the comparison to the lighter colors, you see that most, quite a large number of the countries have not moved a lot compared to the previous version of the scoreboard, while some have moved by more than 2 positions. Here you see, for example, at the end, quite stable. The final group here in yellow, and then we have quite a large range of orange countries which have lost up to 2 positions, and in light green, the countries that have gained up to 2 positions, and then in darker red as before, or in darker green, countries that have lost more than 2 positions or gained more than 2 positions. But and this is also a frequent observation. Quite often it's not much more than 2 positions. There may be 3 positions lost, so it's relatively rare that there is a very strong change in positions, but it happens in 1 or 2 cases in the scoreboard. So this is the overall ranking here, and then in the following, this compares the 3 components which you have seen at the beginning. So this is the level comparison, the first component, which as you remember, is composed by the levels from the different sectors and the end users, as I described when I introduced the scoreboard here. And you see also in this case, I already used the same principle of coloring position changes, which are not too large in lighter colors, or which remain the same in yellow, and only the ones which have introduced larger changes in red, losses of positions, or in green, gains in positions. Overall, also for the level, there is some change for some of the countries here, but not in many cases a strong loss in position, which shows that the scoreboard starts to be relatively stable, and smaller changes arrive over time, which would then be interesting to follow up further in the years. So this is the level. Same for trend. Here you see similar picture here in the trend. For quite some countries, it's smaller changes compared to the previous positions. You see, for example, if I take the case of Ireland, Ireland has gained 1 position. Estonia has lost in the top positions, but still there are both in the number 5 countries, for example. And similar, if you take intermediate levels, you see countries, for example, at the end, that are still in the same group as previously. Finally, for the policy picture, also relatively stable. There is some move here. You see in some countries some darker green, or for some countries some darker red, notably for Denmark and and France, but overall for most of the countries, not a dramatic change. We have not yet the full set of national energy and climate policies. So we will see what impact this has compared to the policies which we have collected so far. But overall, it's also a relatively stable picture that can be provided and derived when one looks to stronger changes in the scoreboard. A quick look to one or two sectors here. The residential sector, this is the overall result, but for the residential sector here. And you see that some countries have made larger changes, notably Ireland here has improved quite a lot, while others remain essentially in the same part of the scoreboard, like Luxembourg, Germany, Netherlands, or Latvia, for example. And the same, if one looks here, for example, towards the end of the scoreboard, there's a group of 4 countries where the positions have remained unchanged, essentially for the residential sector. This is, as a second example for comparison, the industry sector. Here, some more changes are observed as compared, for example, to the residential sector. But as I said in the beginning, quite often the changes which are marked with darker color here are limited, let's say, to quite often to a step of 3. So still it remains a bit in the vicinity of the original positioning. As we talk about methodologies, scoreboard is also always scoring is always a learning process, and these are examples from observations which we make when we check about the scores. For example, this is a checking from the industry sector and the level in industry on the first 10 countries, which has been done by our partner Enerdata here. And you see that while for most of the countries there was not a dramatic change, but for Lithuania, for example, there was a quite important change. And we found out that there was an error which we had in the scoreboard, which led to a different positioning in the level of Lithuania concerning the industry sector. That's the upper example. And the lower example is from residential sector. Again, the level, the first 10 countries, you see changes are limited, but for Denmark, in this part of the scoreboard, there was quite some change. And in fact, this was due to data issue, because the final consumption of domestic hot water was estimated. It is 20% of the heating consumption, and it was much lower than the value collected this year. So this impacted here in the scoring to quite some degree. So this also shows methodological issues which we follow up both from the data quality aspects, data quality assurance aspect, but also from the data collection aspect, and is surely something which will further improve the quality of the scoreboard. Based on the policy analysis, I would like to elaborate a bit more on an issue which we had touched upon in one of our webinars, I think in September, where we talked about diverging impacts of climate and energy efficiency policies. While climate policies clearly aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, aim to reduce CO2 emissions, they not necessarily aim to improve energy efficiency and to reduce energy demand. And I wanted to illustrate that with one example where we have been looking up very closely in Germany, industrial measures for energy efficiency. because when one looks at the impacts in terms of CO2 savings, they are quite important. While when one looks at the impacts in terms of energy savings, energy efficiency improvement, they are rather they are much more limited. And for this, I apologize for this. This is in German. I will try to improve on this in the version on the web. But you see here from a major source which we use also for the MURE database, which is the projection report of Germany, for which our institute does the investigation, the analysis of the industrial measures, both with respect to greenhouse gas savings or CO2 savings. You see that on the left-hand side for a number of measures like emission trading, which is important for industry, like CO2, like carbon prices for the sectors, transport and heat, which also concerns industry to some degree. We have the European Innovation Fund for which is linked to the emission trading scheme, and we have a specific German promotion program for decarbonization in industry, which is a national program. And also we have so-called IPCEIs for hydrogen, which try to promote the penetration of hydrogen, which leads to CO2 savings, but not necessarily to energy savings. And we also have a number of efficiency standards under eco design for electric motors, for example. And you see from the figures in the lower hand over the time period from 2025 to 2050, quite some reduction in greenhouse gases in the so-called with measure scenarios or with additional measure scenarios, which includes more measures. You see in these 25 years nearly a factor of 3 in the emissions of the industry sector. And on the right-hand side, you see the same instruments and their impact concerning the fuel use here. And on the next slide, we will see the electricity use. You already see from the comparisons that there is a reduction in fuel use, fossil fuel use. But overall, if you look at the lowest lines, the scenarios in the beginning of the period, 2025, 2030, there is still a reduction in industrial energy demand. But then after 35, in these projections, roughly speaking, this effect ends and it gets worse if one considers electricity. So here, this is the same slide as previous, but on the right-hand side, I have replaced the electricity use or the electricity savings in quotation marks, because as noted here, this is in fact an increase in electricity because there is an electrification of processes, sorry, which leads to the savings of the fuels, which you just observed, and overall still leads to some savings if one puts fuels and electricity together. But compared to the CO2 savings, the impact is much less if one calculates the net savings out of increased electricity use and decreased fuel uses. And this is also presented here in this graph. You see left-hand side the additional, sorry, the with measure scenario, and then the right-hand side the with additional measure scenario. And what is really notable here is that after 2030, 2035, there is no reduction in the energy demand anymore. You see penetrations of fuels like hydrogen that use more energy and so on, electricity naturally penetrating. But overall, the demand for final energy in the industrial sector remains very, very flat and far away from a strong improvement of energy efficiency. This observation underlines the role of classical policies, and I would like to point to another project which I'm currently working on in the frame of my work for the European Energy and Climate Policy Institute, IECP. This is the EU-MURE project, which is aiming to replace old electric motors in industry. And in fact, electric motors, they are responsible for more than 2/3 of industrial electricity uses. And this is in fact, if this policy is or these observations are translated into policies, there are some policies which are listed here: financial policy subsidies, there are also tax reductions, voluntary agreements, and so on. But overall, quite a large number of electric motors are still very old and can be replaced in order to free space in the electricity uses, but it requires more stringent national policies. We have some policies in Germany for industry, naturally, but electric motors, they are just part of it and not specifically considered. And this is why they are not very strongly followed up. But as you see from this previous slide, this type of policies is really very important to free space for the forthcoming electricity uses. As time is advancing, I would like to come to a final part of the presentation here. The scoreboard compares the different countries and the policies, notably in the different countries. But what the scoreboard does not do for the moment, it does not say if you are good in the scoreboard, are you good enough with respect to the targets? And this is something which we have for the moment not built into the scoreboard. We had at the beginning, when we discussed quite intensively also different versions of how to score, there is also the possibility to initiate a scoring compared to the energy efficiency potentials or compared to energy efficiency targets. And in that case, one would see that quite a number of countries, or all of our countries, are still quite away from achieving good scores, if that would be introduced. So not necessarily if you have a good position in the scoreboard, you can lean back and be quiet. I have here prepared a link to the website. I will move to the scoreboard, to the assessment tool here, and I hope you can see this screen. I will very briefly explain how this scoring works. In fact, this scoring is based on the MURE database, on the measures which we have collected in the MURE database, the quantitative impacts of the measures, and it compares the measures with a scenario or the difference in two scenarios. In fact, we take on one hand the Prime's reference scenario, which from 2020, which is the last available version, which is used quite intensively by the European Commission to evaluate the progress in the energy system. And there is also scenarios which have been calculated in the frame of the Green Deal. Here, the scenario I've chosen is called FF55 for the 55 greenhouse gas target to be achieved in 2030. Mixed scenario. This is one, I said, one of the policy scenarios for delivering the Green Deal. And the difference between the two can be interpreted in a way that on one hand, we have a kind of business as usual scenario, the reference scenario, and on one hand, we have a target scenario, which tries to be in line with carbon neutrality in 2050. And the assessment tool compares the measure impacts which we derive from the MURE database with these differences, and then shows how much has been achieved in 2030 or would be achieved in 2030 if we rely on those measures and they achieve their impacts, and how much is still missing here. Here you see the example of the European Union. You see here the two scenarios in blue, the reference scenario, and in orange, the FI55 mix scenario, and the gap between is covered by different measures. You see a number of measures contributing to that, and the yellow part of the column is the part which is not yet covered by measures as we have proposed them in the national energy and climate policies and as they are gathered in the MURE database. So there is a gap, for example, remaining here, and you can also see from the assessment tool for which sectors the measures, in which sectors the measures are contributing. And there is also, for example, a measure table where you can see all of the measures which are contributing here and which are derived from the MURE database. So this is something which we would like to develop more in future. And this assessment tool will also allow, for example, in future to include factor which, for example, represent gaps in implementing measures, so implementation factors or impact factors if measures do not achieve the impact they are sought to have, or we have interaction factors which relate to the fact that policies can interact in future. So this was a quick look to this tool, and as I said, this tool has the aspiration to complement the scoreboard in order to have a comparison with the targets and see where we stand with respect to the different policy targets. I come to the conclusion of my presentation so that we would have enough time for the discussion. So what I showed you in the comparison between the 2023 and the 2024 version of the scoreboard, sorry, there is a comparatively stable evolution for levels, trends, and policies. You see for most of the countries limited changes in the positions and also in the overall score, but there are certainly differences for a handful of countries which we further investigate. And you saw also the methodological issues. Scoring is a learning process. There is a data quality investigation behind which we develop further, and also a look to the data issues, as I exemplified with this slide concerning industry and residential sector, Lithuania and Denmark. There's also an issue in the policy scoreboard, which is aiming at energy efficiency. You see that a number of measures, as I exemplified for Germany, do have limited impacts in terms of energy efficiency. And I think this is also an interesting analysis, which important climate policies have limited impact in energy efficiency field and why this is so. And I also showed finally new methodological development around this policy assessment tool that will allow us increasingly to compare also the performance of the countries with respect to the targets. As said at the beginning, the scoreboard does, as it is constructed now, show the relative positioning of the countries, but it does not say necessarily how good the best countries are with respect to the targets achievement. So we think this could be a quite complementary tool to the scoreboard itself. With this, I would like to stop my presentation and give the floor to questions.